A lot of times when you hear me introduce people, or speakers here, you may hear me say that it's a privilege or an honor for me to do it, but it truly is tonight. It's someone that I know a little bit and have great admiration for, both personally and professionally. We're joined tonight by Judge Gary Wade. And I'm going to add a little bit to his resume and telling you that he is a Sevier County High School graduate, which he and I do have that in common. That's about where it ends, though, really. Well, we're Sevier County natives, and we're both Sevier County High School graduates, but we're very honored to have Gary here with us tonight. He received both, aside from graduating from Sevier County High School, he received both his law degree and his undergraduate degree from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And from 1972 to 1987, he practiced law in Sevierville. He also served as the Sevierville City Mayor numerous terms. He was the City Attorney for the City of Pigeon Forge for a number of years. And in 1993, he helped co-found Friends of the Great Smokies, which has a history of generating over $60 million in support of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was appointed to the Supreme Court in 2006. The state Supreme Court, and served as Chief Justice from September the 1st, 2012 until August the 31st, 2014. And he now serves as the Dean of the Lincoln Memorial Duncan School of Law. And he is married, and he and his wife Sandy live in Sevierville. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome him here tonight, and please make him welcome Judge Gary Wade.
Thank you, Butch. You know, I'm almost hesitant to point out that you left out the fact that I was a notary public in Sevier County. Thank you for coming here tonight. You probably had a long day, and it's going to get longer still tonight. But I enjoyed being with Butch and City Manager Earlene Teaster today to talk about old times in Sevierville. We had some of you have come back for a second dose, and I apologize to you for taking even more of your time tonight. But I'm glad you mentioned the Chief Justice thing, because I was supposed to get a haircut this afternoon between talking at lunch and now, and I always go to Johnny Sims. And in 2014, just a few days before I was to be sworn in as Chief Justice for the State Supreme Court, I decided I needed to go over and get a haircut. And on Friday morning, the Mountain Press, I was to be sworn in the following day, the Mountain Press had a front page article. The Mountain Press, if you don't know, is the New York Times of Sevier County. And they had a story, said Wade to be sworn in as Chief Justice. And when I went into the barbershop, Johnny Sims, who's been cutting hair since he was 17 years old, he started with his father, and Johnny is now 76 years old. And I guess he cut my hair when he was 17 or 18, and the last haircut I got, I went to Johnny Sims. But let me tell you about this particular day. I went in the barbershop. If you've been in that barbershop, you know he always has the Mountain Press where it can be seen. And I saw the headlines, and I thought he might say something about it. And I sat in his chair, and he started cutting my hair. And when he didn't say anything right away, I said, Johnny, have you read the newspaper this morning? And he said, yes, I have. And I said, did you see the headlines? And he says, what do you mean? I said, Johnny, don't you know that I'm going to be sworn in as Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court just around the corner at the courthouse tomorrow morning? And he said, yes. As a matter of fact, me and one of my customers was laughing about that earlier this morning. So all you got to do is go home if you ever... I'm here to talk about our national park. And you really can't talk about the Smokies unless you can establish your bona fides. And my bona fides with the park actually come through my mother's side of the family. Some of you have been around a while, probably know a Reagan. And my mother was a Reagan before she married. And she was seventh generation. And to move the Reagan family on back to the time they came into Sevier County, the first Reagan to arrive was Timothy Reagan. And he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And he was injured twice during the Revolutionary War. The first time he came home, stayed about 6 months, and got better, so he went back. And of course, shot a second time, came home, recovered, and decided to go to Tennessee. My view about Timothy Reagan was that he made good target practice for the British, but he settled in the Middle Creek area, not far from here. And he's buried in the White Oak Flat Cemetery in Gatlinburg. He had a son named Richard, who had a son named Daniel Wesley. And Daniel Wesley Reagan was the first white child born in what we call Pittman Center today, but back then we called it the Emmerts Cove community. Now, Daniel Wesley had a son named Ephraim. And Ephraim had two wives. The first wife didn't survive him, probably because she had 13 children by him. And the second wife did survive him, however, but only after 11 more children. So he had 24 children. And he lived to age 94 and didn't die of old age. A limb fell out of a tree on his head, and he died in an accidental death. He had 99 grandchildren. Can you imagine that? Can any one of you name all of your grandchildren? Sure. But 99, you'd need a scorecard. So, one of his wives was a Whaley. Ever hear that name about the mountain people? Some of you may have seen the Whaley family here. That's a long story, but anyway, I'm related to the Whaleys through the Reagans. And then he had a son, Ephraim did, one of the many sons, by the name of John. And John married an Ogle. And if you've been in Sevier County a little while, you know or are related to the Ogle family. And so John had a son by the name of West. And West had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, and one of the girls was named Kate, and Kate was my mother. So I'm 8th generation Sevier County. Daniel Wesley, after leaving Emmerts Cove, moved into the Sugar Lands in the National Park. And from then on, all of the Reagans lived in the Sugar Lands, including my grandfather, West Reagan. And West Reagan worked at Ogle's store in downtown Gatlinburg when he was a teenager. And he married one of his cousins, probably, a Franklin, and who lived downriver a ways. And they, as I said, they had 5 children. He actually moved to Knoxville to get a job. And my mother was actually reared in Knoxville, but her home has always been in the park. Now, some people say that and many would accurately say that they were moved out of the park and they regretted being moved out of the park. That mean old federal government took their land and paid for it. But my grandfather's family was pretty happy about it because they didn't have anything, and when they saw that they were going to be paid in cash money for their land, they were happy to move elsewhere. How many of you know what the second largest community in Sevier County was during World War I? Any guesses out there? You know about Sevierville, of course. It was the largest, founded in 1796, I believe. What? Sugar Land's close. Greenbrier's close. All the Whaleys lived in Greenbrier. If you don't marry within your own family and they're not good enough for you, who is, right? But it wasn't Pigeon Forge, it wasn't Seymour, it wasn't Gatlinburg, it wasn't Pittman Center, it was actually Elkmont. And thus, the story of the national park. This man is Colonel W.B. Townsend, and I had a heck of a time finding a photograph of him. I had to go into the park archives to get a photo of Colonel Townsend. He came to our area in 1901, and he had two other investors, and they formed a company called the Little River Railroad and Lumber Company. Now there is a historic marker about the Little River Company, and it existed until 1939. But Colonel Townsend built 150 miles of railroad, and during his 38 years of operation, they cut over 560,000, I think you call it board lumber. Yeah. So obviously they were around a long time. Now if you know the park was actually opened in 1934, and you might ask why he was still cutting timber. But when the national park began, or the area that is now the national park, better said, was owned 2/3 by lumber companies. And all those, the 2/3 that the lumber companies had owned had been pretty much clear cut. Here's a train that Colonel Townsend utilized. There is actually a museum over in Townsend called the Little River Railroad and Lumber Company Museum. And this depicts the railroad, and you see the huge lumber. Interestingly, during this time, the American chestnut blight hit our area. 1904, it hit New York. And by 1940, all the American chestnuts, save just a few, none around here, were killed. Over 4 billion trees were killed. And in our area alone, where the American chestnut was so important for survival, homes were built out of chestnuts, rail fences were built out of chestnuts, furniture was built out of chestnuts. It was perfect for all of those things. And it didn't rot. It lasted a long time. And moreover, chestnuts roasting over the open fire. There was a food source for the families in the mountains. But look at the size of those logs. 1 out of every 4 hardwood trees in the Smokies were American chestnuts. You hikers, you'll see them growing out of the roots still, but very rarely do they get past maturity, and I have yet to find an American chestnut that has chestnuts that are actually edible. This depicts the clear-cutting ways of the lumber companies in those days. And as I said, they would go in by railroad in clear-cut areas. Here is one of the smaller engines that was used to get up and around the railroad tracks. And there is another. And there is a depiction of the Little River Railroad Company as it existed in Townsend back in the early 1900s. This is important. Around 1907, 1908, people in Knoxville found that they could get on Southern Railway and take a train to Townsend and then get on the Little River Railroad and go on up to the Elkmont area to hunt and fish. And in 1910, Colonel Townsend gave 50 acres for the construction of the Appalachian Club. Have any of you been in the Elkmont area and seen the Appalachian Club? It's been restored recently by the Friends of the Smokies. And several of the homes there have been restored. But soon after the men came up to hunt and fish, their families decided that they liked to go to the area to swim and to get away from the heat in downtown Knoxville. So before you know it, Colonel Townsend starts selling lots around the Appalachian Club and does pretty well. Well, the Appalachian Club wouldn't take everybody. There is the Appalachian Club. And if you were not among the blue bloods who had access to the Appalachian Club, and it is restored, they went to the Wonderland. 2 years after the construction of the Appalachian Club, the Wonderland Hotel and Club was built. I know that some of you have seen the Wonderland Hotel before it finally just decayed and fell in. Sandy and I went up the last week it was opened. It was the only time we had ever been there as guests, and we had lunch there, fried chicken on a Sunday. I'll come back to the Wonderland in a little bit, but here are some of the cabins that those of you who've been to Elkmont have seen. Now, let's talk about how the national park movement really began. Horace Kephart. Horace Kephart was what we call in these parts a drinking man. And he had a wife, and I think 5 children in Michigan, or St. Louis, and he was quite renowned as a librarian there. But apparently he had such a tough time handling his addiction that he decided to come to the Smokies, and he settled on the North Carolina side. Some of you have been to Mount Kephart, where he named after him, obviously, but he wrote Our Southern Highlanders, and that was a book about the people that he found in our area, primarily on the North Carolina side. And his writings really introduced America to these mountains, the Smokies. His closest friend during this time was Japanese. George Masa moved to the Smokies in 1901. He moved from Japan to the United States in 1901, and 14 years later found his way to Asheville, where he worked as a bellhop for the Grove Park Inn. He began taking photographs, and 4 years later, and I think he met Kephart during this period of time, Masa decided that he would become a professional photographer, and his business is still in Asheville. But he spent most of his time in the mountains, and he had a contraption on wheels that he made out of bicycles so that he could measure the trails and how long they were. But his photographs again began to tell the tale of the Smokies, but mostly on the North Carolina side. Interestingly, today, Masa Knob is located right next to Mount Kephart, and appropriately so because they were such great friends. Paul Fink from Jonesboro is a person who really doesn't get a lot of attention, but he was on a commission during the formative years before our park came into existence, and he advocated moving the Appalachian Trail into the Smokies. The original drawings had it going through Mount Mitchell over in North Carolina, and it missed our park altogether. So we give Paul Fink, Masa, credit for persuading the commission to move the Appalachian Trail into the Smokies. That way North Carolina and Tennessee are a part of the Appalachian Trail. Now back to Elkmont. Ann Davis is called the mother of our national park. In 1920, she and her husband, Willis Davis, decided to go out west to see the national parks out there, Yellowstone and Yosemite. And basically they came back saying, you know, we have a pretty nice place here in the Smokies. And the way they were introduced to the Smokies was that they bought a lot in Elkmont and they had a little cabin in Elkmont. So they were the first advocates. Now Willis was quite prominent, and he was the president of Knoxville Iron Works. And Willis was a member of the Rotary Club, the East Tennessee Automobile Club, and the Chamber of Commerce in Knoxville. Now think about Knoxville about 1920. It wasn't all that big a town. And really, if you were a member of those clubs, you knew pretty much everybody that was anybody in Knoxville, Tennessee. And interestingly, his membership acquainted him with others who joined with him and his wife to make our national park. In 1924, Ann Davis ran for and was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. The governor, who was elected at the same time, was Austin Peay. Austin Peay had a relative who had a cabin in Elkmont. That may be one of those that is of the 19 or so that will be saved and have been saved. But he knew where the Smokies, although from Middle Tennessee, from the Clarksville area, he knew about the Smokies. And that was important because it wasn't easy to get the legislature to pony up $2 million as their part for the national park. This is Mayor Ben Morton, and I know most, if not all of you, have been to Morton Overlook. Ben Morton was the mayor of Knoxville during this time, and he was likely a member of the Rotary Club, the Chamber of Commerce, and the East Tennessee Automobile Club. And so what did they talk about during these years? The World War I was over, and they knew about Elkmont. Other states had national parks, so they decided that they wanted one for this area. Morton is really important in the formation of the park, because the Knoxville Chamber had paid $5,000 to transport all of the legislators into Townsend. They then went to Cades Cove for a picnic, and they got on the train and got to see the Elkmont area. And of course, the Knoxvillians who paid their way up thought that naturally the legislature would approve the appropriation that they had sought, some $2 million. Same thing was going on over in North Carolina. Mostly people from Asheville were asking the people in their capital city, their elected officials, to appropriate $2 million as well. Ann Davis got it passed in the House of Representatives, but doggone it, it failed in the Senate. So what did Ben Morton do? He arranged with others to propose to Colonel Townsend the purchase of 76,000 acres in the park at $3.58 an acre. Now that was quite a handsome sum during those days, and it came out, I think, to be somewhere around $273,000. So the state turned that purchase down. They would not commit to that $2 million. Even though the governor advocated it, and even though the House of Representatives approved it, the Senate did not. He led the movement, Morton did, to ask his city council to appropriate 1/3 of the purchase price as an enticement for the state to join in that first purchase. Now think about that. That's sort of like someone in Kingsport asking the city of Pigeon Forge to make an appropriation of several $100,000 or more today for a project in Sullivan County. And people in Knoxville were puzzled about that. Some were. And while it passed council, first vote 6-5, then all the naysayers changed their vote to vote for it. So officially it passed 11-0, but that wasn't the end of the story. Folks in Knoxville were pretty hacked off about it, some of them were, and they recalled 4 of the councilmen who voted for it. And 3 of them were defeated in the recall. But nevertheless, the deed was done. And that $91,000 persuaded the state of Tennessee, and particularly the Senate, to change their votes and make that first purchase. And that was a part of what became a $2 million gift from the state of Tennessee or a pledge to build. One thing that, just to parenthetically, a lot of people ask why we don't have an admission fee in the Smokies. Anybody know the answer to that? Well, well, I thought for a time that the Congress had made that stipulation, because never before had a national park been created out of private lands. And then I thought, well, maybe North Carolina did restricted it so that there wouldn't be any admission fee. But that wasn't so. That tough Tennessee General Assembly decided not to give their money unless the land was restricted, so that never would there be an admission fee to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. People kind of offer that as a remedy today for a lot of the backlog of projects that exists in the park. But there certainly would have been no Friends of the Smokies or other support groups for the Smokies had there been an admission fee. And I sort of like the idea of us, God loves a cheerful giver, and those of us who help the national park, I mean, what better cause is there than to help preserve and protect a national treasure like the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. But very courageous man. Didn't serve very long after that, perhaps because a few people were unhappy with his spending the city of Knoxville money on a project in Sevier and Blount counties. Colonel David Chapman probably gets more credit than anyone else. When the Rotary Club, East Tennessee Automobile Club, Chamber of Commerce all got together, they decided, well, we really need to have one organization to do this. So they created the Great Smoky Mountain Association, and Colonel Chapman is the first president. And then ultimately, he was given the task of making all of the private purchases in the national park. It was quite an ordeal for him, and they got started with buying the land, but they realized that they needed to collect money from the private sector, and as much as they could, and he did a lot of fundraising. But they had $2 million from North Carolina, $2 million commitment from Tennessee, and they collected over time about $1.1 million in private donations. And they got about halfway through purchasing what they needed, and they ran out of money. So, I mustn't leave out Jim Thompson. All the old black and white photos come out of Thompson Photo, which is still in Knoxville. Lovely photographs. If you ever want to have some fun in downtown Knoxville and you love history and the history of the park, they have more pictures taken by Jim Thompson and his staff of the Smokies than Carter's got liver pills. Arno Kammerer was the assistant director of the National Park Service from 1919 until about 19 1933. Kammerer was a lawyer, and but he very much enjoyed the national parks. And when it was proposed to him that we wouldn't have a national park unless we were able to double our dollars, he wrote a letter to John D. Rockefeller Jr. You know, Standard Oil, senior, and then junior comes along. And there is John D. Rockefeller Jr. And he was a supporter of national parks, and their family still is very much involved in national parks. Acadia in Maine is perhaps their favorite. But he had donated $5 million for the Shenandoah Park, and Kammerer talked him into donating another $5 million for the Smokies. So $5 million suddenly became $10 million, and we were going to make it as soon as that happened. I put this photograph in because it looked, this is him as an older man, but it looked a whole lot like his son, Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York for a lot of years. And for those of you old enough to remember when Gerald Ford was president, his son, Nelson Rockefeller, was vice president. And the Rockefellers had never been to the national park to be given an appropriate thank you. Now that was the thank you. That is the construction of the Rockefeller Memorial at Newfound Gap. And of course, what a lovely tribute that is to the family, but the Rockefellers were never there. On September 2nd, 1940, FDR made his second trip to the Smokies. He had come earlier in 1936, right after the Smokies had opened, and he came back in 1940 just as we were about to enter World War II. You see Roosevelt on the left. You know who's on the right? Eleanor Roosevelt. Anybody guess who's in the middle? No, I'll tell that story though if you'll let me. This is Governor Prentice Cooper. Now I told this story at lunch today, and Butch reminded me about it. There are basically two religions in Sevier County. One of them is Baptist, and the other is Republican. So it was quite a sight to see when we had a Democratic president come into Sevier County. And of course, Prentice Cooper was a governor as well. Prentice Cooper's grandson is now a Congressman Cooper out of Middle Tennessee. But they obviously came, and here's the photograph of the dedication of the park. Let me go back just a second to Rockefeller. Because they had never been here, about 5 years into after the creation of Friends of the Smokies, we learned that one of our board members, Mimi Cecil, she married into the Vanderbilt family. She was a New York lawyer, and she married Bill Cecil, who was the son of Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil, and of course her father built the Biltmore over in North Carolina, so they're pretty well connected people. But it turned out that Mimi, who was a very quiet, understated member of our board, mentioned casually that she knew Nelson Rockefeller's older sister and John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s oldest child, Abby. And so they invited her down to the Biltmore for a gathering of sorts, and just gave our superintendent a chance to say thank you. And then Governor Phil Bredesen drove from Nashville to greet Abby and to speak on behalf of Tennessee, thanking them for their contribution to the park. That's a very popular photograph, historic in many ways, and of course FDR is the only person ever to visit the park. Now we'll tell you about the Ralph Murphy story. Sevierville, Park Road, Courthouse, you know where they are. That block was about it. And of course, we didn't have any Democratic elected officials in those days, but we did have a postmaster. And the postmaster was always the same party in those days as the president. And our postmaster was Ralph Murphy. So when the Roosevelt entourage came onto Park Road, they made a right turn at the old post office down Bruce Street towards the courthouse. They picked up Ralph Murphy as a part of the entourage. They went on to Court Avenue. They turned left onto Court Avenue and then turned left on Joy Street where my mom and dad lived. And my mother has the most beautiful photograph taken off of her mother-in-law's front porch of Roosevelt with that trademark cigarette holder in his mouth as they drove by, and he had that classic Roosevelt smile. And interestingly, on that street, I mentioned earlier today there were 6 widows, my parents, and J.B. Waters, who developed that area, and his wife. And everybody on that street was a Democrat except my mother and the Waters family. So he was in good company as he drove by. We talked about, I want to talk to you about some of the people who did not leave the park. These are the Walker sisters. They stayed over in Little Greenbrier. Some of you been to the schoolhouse there in their home. I married a couple at their home one year a long time ago. And anyway, that's the Walker sisters. And one or two of them wrote poems, and they would sell their poems for 25 cents to people who came to visit. But they stayed in the park until they all died. For some reason, that they were able to reserve a life estate and probably gave the property back. Elkmont was different. By then, it was a little town, and doggone it if Chapman didn't run out of money again. And again, these folks loved their community, and they wanted to keep it. And they hired a lawyer, and they got appraisals, and the appraisals were too high for Chapman to pay. So they ended up with a compromise. All the families got this would have been 1932. They got 20-year leases in return for selling their homes at half price. And they had some political clout that continued on for a while. That 20-year lease went to 1952. They were able to persuade the Park Service to grant another 20-year lease to 1972. And then 1972, with the help of Howard Baker, they were able to get another 20 years. But these are some of the cabins that are in the Elkmont area. So we had the Walker sisters and families still going into the Elkmont area until 1992. And actually, it was another 10 years until the last 3 leases terminated. But they had homes. Now, this is a later picture of the Wonderland Hotel. And this is what it looked like when Sandy and I made our last visit in 1992. Now, I want to tell you about this guy. I went to church camp when I was 8 years old over in Blount County. And I met a guy that looked like that fellow on the left at church camp. He was same age as me, but I just really enjoyed his personality. He had one of those Gatlinburg hats with the feather coming at it. It had Tommy printed across, and that impressed me for some reason. And And his parents ended up having Trotter's Restaurant in Pigeon Forge. Anybody ever eat at Trotter's Restaurant? Very popular family-style restaurant. And Tommy grew up in the restaurant. I'm sure they got a little bit of work out of him. And by the following fall, he came to our school, and I recognized him immediately. He was in my class in the 5th grade, and we have been friends and played ball together in school. And he is now a very prominent architect in Gatlinburg. The reason I mention Tommy is that and this is my first introduction, by the way, to hiking in the Smokies. This is my older brother, Dwight, on the left, who was probably about 16 at the time, and the second oldest brother, Ken, and they hiked the Appalachian Trail within the park, about 71 miles. I'm sure it took 2 or 3 days, but I was probably 8 years old at the time, and my younger brother, Sid, was 7, so there wasn't any way Mom and Dad were going to let us join them. But I wanted you to see Dwight, because Dwight and I, although we grew up partly in Pittman Center and had access to the Greenbrier section of the park, and often went there, swam there, fished there, just had an idyllic time in a little cabin that my father and mother purchased built in 1950. And but obviously they enjoyed hiking, and they kind of passed it down to all of us. But Tom and Dwight was always an avid hiker. Basically decided after one of our hikes to Mount Cameron that something needed to be done. And Tom followed up on it. He went to the superintendent's office after we'd been up there, because we'd found this beautiful fire tower, Western style, the only one of its kind east of the Mississippi. And it was in deplorable condition, graffiti written all over it. And we happened to pass a ranger on the trail, and the ranger, he complained to the ranger, why don't you, said, we don't have any money, but go talk to the park superintendent, he may be able to help you. So Tom went to the park superintendent, and Randy Pope was the superintendent at the time, and he suggested to Randy that they really needed to do something. And moreover, he said, after Randy explained that they didn't have money for things like that anymore, that their appropriations for maintenance, their capital backlog, as they call it, was just had just been flat for years, and it was in the millions of dollars that were needed to do what they wanted to do. So Tom says, I'll tell you what, if you will find a way to refurbish that fire tower, I'll do all of the architectural planning for you and make sure you meet all of the requirements of the National Park Service for reconstruction. And Randy says, well, how are we going to pay for it? And he says, don't worry, I'll get my friend Gary Wade to raise the money for it. Well, as it turned out, that was the first step towards the formation of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Tom lit the fire by going to see Randy Pope. Randy Pope, in fairness, had seen what a friends group had done at Yosemite and how they had handled some of their capital backlog. And in truth, I think Randy might have gotten there eventually, but Tom's conversation sparked the formation of what Randy decided to call the Friends of the Smokies. And it was actually a couple of years later, and without going into detail as to why the delay, I was invited to be on the board of some familiar names at that time that I did not know but knew of. Natalie Haslam, Jim Haslam's wife. Her first husband had a cabin in Elkmont, and she visited there as a child, so she had a strong interest in the park. Mayor Ben Morton's granddaughter, Judy, was invited to the meeting, and she was among those in Knoxville who all knew each other and loved the park and had the funds to donate for improvements to the park. And one of my favorite people of all time, Lindsey Young. Lindsey, by that time, and his twin brother, Robert, owned the Buckhorn Inn. They bought it from the Bebb estate. And he had bought it because they had been moved out of Elkmont, and they wanted a place in the mountains. And so when Lindsey saw an opportunity to come on the board and perhaps have some influence on what historic structures were saved, particularly in the Elkmont area, he was very interested. Now, by then, Lindsey was 85 years old. He had never married. He had accumulated quite an estate by investing in lumber and coal in and around Jellicoe towards Kentucky. And he was, in those days, if you ever saw a philanthropic effort and had so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so as being donors, if you got down to the bottom, you'd usually see anonymous, because Lindsey didn't want to be identified as a donor. And yet everybody in the Knoxville area knew that when they saw anonymous, it was actually Lindsey Young. So it didn't do him any good to give anonymously. Everybody ultimately knew about it. But now, the first fundraising event we had, I persuaded Jim Ogle and my friend Jim, and 8 generations removed. I guess he would be my first cousin, 8 times removed. Is that the way you say it? But Jim lived in Emerson Cove, and he loves the Smokies, and I persuaded him to have a fundraiser one year at his home, and we had G.H. Connor, who is in the center. He's the auctioneer, and he donated his time. And to G.H.'s right is Steve Caldwell. Steve was a coach he was defensive ends coach for the University of Tennessee Volunteers at that time, and this was about the time that Coach Fulmer took over from Coach Majors. And Jim and Coach Fulmer had been friends while Philip was an assistant coach, and he loved to come to Emmerich Cove to visit in the summer. And Steve came with him, and also Dan Brooks. And ironically, all 3 of those men have homes in the Pittman Center area now. They have all. Steve hasn't retired. Philip, as you know, is now the athletic director. But Dan Brooks, after Philip lost his job as head coach, he coached at Clemson, and so he got one of those national championship rings from Clemson to match the one that he had at Tennessee. And so he decided that he had done all he wanted to do as a football coach, and he now is planting his garden in Pittman Center. That is my thank you for all my years with the Smokies. Getting one of those hats is really a big deal. That one's a little bit large, don't you think? But anyway, we had a function, and they were kind enough to give me a Smokies hat, and I still have it on display. And here's the Mount Camera Fire Tower. This is a painting of it, and this is how we raise money for the Mount Camera Fire Tower. And the West Knoxville Rotary Club was persuaded Terry Chandler, a local artist, to paint Mount Camera during this time of the year. And you see the rhododendrons in the foreground, and they sold prints enough to where we were actually able to pay completely for all of the work there. I've often said that as many things as I've done in my life, the one thing that has truly been selfless has been the time I've given to Friends of the Smokies. And I've got a couple of stories to tell, if we've got a moment or two, that relate to my adventure with the formation of the Friends, which, by the way, celebrates its 25th birthday on September 3rd September 3rd of this year. But after watching all of this, it's become apparent to me that there are two qualities that I have seen in people, those cheerful givers, that I enjoy more than any other. And one of the fascinating things that has happened during this period of time is my opportunity to meet Dan and Deaner Matthews, who have a place called the Swag Country Inn over in Jonathan Creek, North Carolina, that borders the national park. And one of the other projects that we have had for the last 21 years has been to have a retreat there. It's a high-cost event that raises about $100,000 over a weekend every year, and has done that for 21 years. And Dan and Deaner have been our hosts, and they have 17 units there at 5,000 feet up, and they donate their 17 units, and we always have a little auction there, and we pay a hefty price for the privilege of going. But one particular weekend stands out above all others. I'm a Methodist, and that is an Episcopalian. Dan is an Episcopalian rector, and at the time he was the rector in the wealthiest Episcopal church in the nation, the Trinity Episcopal in New York City, and it's on Wall Street. And King James had given that church a considerable amount of land in what's now Manhattan, and of course they held on to much of that land, and I believe Dan told me once that the biggest part of his job was determining which of the third world countries to provide grants to during each year. So while he was modestly paid, he had an important position with the church. But he became very familiar with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who attended his retirement party, Dan's, about 10 years ago. And he persuaded the Archbishop and his wife to George Carey and Eileen Carey to come to the Swag weekend with Friends of the Smokies. And the best part of the weekend is the sermon that Dan usually gives on Sunday morning just before we leave. But this time he turned the reins over to George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, to tell you how little I knew about the Archbishop of Canterbury, being a Methodist, I came in on a couple of years earlier when the Archbishop and his wife were visiting Dan at the Swag Country Inn, and he was jet lagged and he fell asleep during dinner, and I really didn't know how big a deal it was to be Archbishop of Canterbury, so I leaned over and asked Dan to tell me a little bit about the Archbishop. I said, "Is this a big deal over in England?" And he looked a little surprised, and I explained that I was from Sevier County and I was a Methodist, and we didn't know much over in the hills. And he said, well, Gary, let me put it this way. Do you know who Queen Elizabeth is? And I said, yes, I know who Queen Elizabeth is. He said, do you know that she has a son named Charles, and that he is the heir to the throne? I said, yes, of course I know that. He says, well, if Charles ever becomes king, the Archbishop of Canterbury will swear him into the office. And so I then understood that this was an important man. He was a very humble man. He was the first commoner ever to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, I later learned. And here's a story that he told, a little sermonette, and I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. He said that he was watching the British Broadcasting Company's television in England, and one of their TV celebrities was interviewing a wealthy American who had amassed quite a fortune in his lifetime in business. And the interviewer asked some really tough questions and got to the final question and said, "Sir, do you mind telling me how much you're worth?" And he says, "Well, I'm worth about $10 million. And the interviewer was shocked. She said, "I have done my research. I'm familiar with your stock portfolio, and I know you to be worth far more than $1 million or $10 million. And he says, "You did not ask me what I possessed. You asked me what I was worth. And I measure my worth by what I'm able to give to others." So, thus the message to all of us to be generous with our gifts. And the other, if you love our park, it's Republican or Democrat, it's hard not to admire Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who wore 20 pounds of steel on his legs and never wanted the public to know that he was unable to walk after having a bout with polio. And when he went up to the Rockefeller Memorial to give his address, the Secret Service agent held a blanket to hide him from the crowd so that they wouldn't see that he had to be helped up to the stairwell. And his, let's see if I can show you, get back to where he was. And there he is standing erect with those braces on his legs. And to all who were in attendance, saw a strong leader for the country just before he led our country into the World War II. Of course, he was elected 4 different times. He was president beginning in 1933 when we were in the full throes of the Depression, and he led us through some of our darkest hours in those days. And about the time we thought that we were all going to survive that terrible Depression, we found ourselves in World War II. And of course, no one else has ever been elected president 4 times. And when he was 63 years old and had just taken his oath of office, he had just spent a very tiring trip for the conference at Yalta. And they called his little home in Warm Springs, Georgia, the Little White House. And he went by rail to the White House. Well, as many of you know, he had a brain aneurysm there and died within an hour or so. And Eleanor, his wife, rushed to his side and made funeral arrangements. And as capable as she was, it was done quickly. And he was put in a 7-foot bronze casket and put on the train in Warm Springs, Georgia, and transported first to the Atlanta, where they stopped and rested for a time. And the mayor, whose name is now that of the Atlanta airport, Hartsfield, is that right? Was there to greet him, and there were 10,000 people in Atlanta to salute the president and say their goodbyes. But a more striking stop was in after they went through South Carolina and maneuvered on up through North Carolina, was in a little town almost to the Virginia border, and it was midnight, and the train had to stop for water. There was a little shanty town within walking distance, and the people there came to pay their respects at midnight. And there was a rich baritone voice that sang this song, "Hand me down my walking cane, I'm going to take the midnight train." And of course then they went on to Washington, D.C., and you remember the horses and how the casket was carried very much the same way that Kennedy was several years later. And his casket was paraded through the streets of Washington. And those are the days of the newspapers. Newspapers were the means of communication at that time, and every newspaper person was there to get a story. And one newspaper man looked across the street and saw a man in overalls who was crying, sobbing uncontrollably as the casket passed by. And so, thinking that there might be a story there, he ran across the street and said, "Sir, did you know the president?" And when he was able to control himself, he said, "No, but he knew me." Now, the relationships that all of us make during our lifetimes are advantages to us in one way, but they're also our legacy, whether it's within our own family or with friends. The people that remember us when we pass on to our greater reward are those relationships we had made during our lifetime and who cherished the memories of the relationships. So after all these years, I have decided that the two qualities I admire most in life are generosity and relationships. And these are the qualities, in my opinion, that inspired the people of Knoxville, the people of North Carolina, and the people of Tennessee to ensure that those of us today will enjoy one of the crown jewels of America, and in fact, America's best idea. And thus, we have the friends of the Great Smoky Mountains in perpetuity supporting the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Thank you very much.